As I was nearing the completion of spending more time in school than is otherwise advisable, I began to apply for jobs to teach biblical studies at universities and seminaries across the country. Some schools required applicants to check a box to a deceptively simple question, saying either yes or no. The question was this: do you agree with our confession of faith? So, trying to be a good Anabaptist who would let my yes be yes and my no be no, I wrestled with what to do. Those confession of faith statements were wordy, and with training as a biblical scholar, it was easy enough to find things I could disagree with. So the truth was invariably no, at least not all of it. But checking no would invite scrutiny of my application and could easily lead to my application being dismissed when they learned what I disagreed with. So I considered checking yes and lying. For moral justification, I drew inspiration from Shiphrah and Puah, the Hebrew midwives who lied to Pharaoh to protect themselves. We'll learn about them next week. But hiding my personal values didn't seem like an option, given that my scholarship worked with feminist and queer approaches to biblical interpretation. I'd be outed soon enough. Which box then to tick? Yes or no? Well, I suspect that many of us haven't heard of Vashti. When the king summoned her to display her beauty before his officials, I could imagine her wrestling with similar questions. Do I say yes, or do I say no? It's a situation, I think, not unlike what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego faced when confronted with the decree to bow before and worship the king's statue in Daniel 3. As Doug Jones laid out for us 2 weeks ago, while they'd otherwise found ways to navigate the tension between sabotage and assimilation, now they faced a choice. I think Vashti's story echoes not only themes like this, but also themes related to gender and discrimination that intersect with Pastor Jerry's sermon from last week. Indeed, Vashti's story in the book of Esther, within which it is set, has long been of interest to feminist biblical scholars. The Woman's Bible was a groundbreaking piece of feminist biblical scholarship published in the late 19th century. In it, Elizabeth Cady Stanton celebrates Vashti as, quote, one who scorned the apostles' command, wives, obey your husbands. Likewise, co-contributor to the project, Lucinda B. Chandler, hails Vashti as, quote, the first woman who dared. As Pastor Jerry put it last week, it's tempting, I think, to make Vashti's story one of women's rights. And I also think our text is more complicated than that. The book of Esther is a short story set in the time after the Babylonian Empire conquered Jerusalem. It opens with the Persian king throwing 2 feasts, the first of which lasts for 180 days. The second features drinking without restraint, and after mentioning the second feast, the text introduces Vashti, who is giving her own banquet for the women of the palace. Verse 11 describes Vashti as fair to behold, in the context of the king commanding his officials to bring her before him so that he could show off her beauty before the people and officials. Verse 12 then reports that Vashti refused to come. The king and his officials move quickly to quell what they fear. Word will get out and we will face gender rebellion. The male leaders issue a proclamation that every man should be master in his own house. And as some of us begin to chuckle, some have wondered, could this be a bit of satire? Perhaps there's a bit of a satirical poke here at the male leaders as the decree comes from a man unable to master his own house. Likewise, their decree spreads word of what Vashti has done, perhaps a bit ironic in that they feared what would happen if others heard, and now their decree spreads word. Likewise, the decree even conveys the ease with which such decrees can be disobeyed. Perhaps another poke at the leaders as they'd like people to comply with this decree. But just as the decree goes out, so too does Vashti, who disappears, and she is eventually replaced by Esther. So Vashti's story is brief. She says nothing and does two things. She gives a banquet and she refuses to come. Once she's replaced by Esther, Esther does intervene to save her people, but the book doesn't suggest that God somehow orchestrated this, working behind the scenes to remove Vashti and ensure Esther was in place for later developments. Indeed, one of the curiosities of the book of Esther is it makes no mention of God at all. What then might we glean and learn from Vashti, a lesser known and overlooked biblical character? Arguably, her most significant act is her refusal to come when summoned, but it's also terribly difficult to interpret because the text doesn't tell us why she refused. I'll pause for just a moment and give you a chance to reflect. Why do you think Vashti refused? Hold on to those ideas. Maybe jot them down as fodder to start sermon talk with. For now, I'll suggest a few options and hope you all can suggest others as well. One option is that maybe Vashti is simply busy with her own banquet. If so, she might refuse because she needs to ensure she can care for the guests at her own banquet. Duty calls, after all. Another option might be that Vashti knows that the king has been displaying the great wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and pomp of his majesty for many days, as verse 4 puts it, and now he wants to show people her beauty. That'd make her like those other things, his object. Her body and her beauty is hers to do with as she wants. She will be no man's object. She refuses to subject herself to the male gaze. Vashti was the woman who dared, as Chandler put it. Another option might make it more complicated than that, if we think about this amidst a patriarchal cultural context that might expect women to not parade their beauty before men other than their husbands. If such cultural norms about female modesty are part of the backdrop of this text, the king made an inappropriate request. If Vashti then complies with this request, she, for her part, could violate gendered expectations for her. From this vantage point, maybe Vashti's refusal seeks to comply with, rather than resist, patriarchal expectations. Expectations about female modesty in this case. Or maybe it's just that Vashti faces an impossible choice when she was summoned. Her options would seem to be to comply or to refuse. If she complies with an improper command, she too will have done something wrong which could lead to its own trouble for her, especially if she anticipates being held accountable for the misbehavior of her husband. So that's not a good option. If, on the other hand, she refuses, well, we know how that went. So that also doesn't seem to be a good option. And maybe there isn't a good option for her. She's between a rock and a hard place. And so I wonder, how do we interpret Vashti's refusal? Is it a story of women's empowerment? It's certainly possible to construe her refusal as her sticking up for herself and her rights as a woman, but I think the text is more complicated, and not just because of the lack of a clear answer about why she refuses. For instance, by the end of chapter 1, male dominance is legislated. In the next chapter, the king will gather beautiful young virgins, including Esther, from throughout the provinces to see which one would please him enough to become Vashti's replacement. Of course, in this contest, the girl's consent is irrelevant. So men in power respond to Vashti's refusal with actions that further harm other women and girls. As Pastor Jerry said last week, reflecting on the daughters of Zelophehad, sometimes it feels like 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards. But while there might have been some apparent or temporary gains for the daughters of Zelophehad, the response of the men in power in Vashti's story may feel more simply like 2 steps backwards. But perhaps the gain here is in the crack her refusal inserts into the patriarchal system. Her refusal leads to fear, substantial fear, among the men in power. Memucan, one of the king's officials, frames her actions as not simply against the king, but against all the officials and all the people who are in all the provinces. Yes, if you were counting, that was all 3 times in quick succession. Surely he is overreacting to the situation, right? Perhaps, or perhaps not. Memucan continues by explaining why he sees it in such terms. If the other women hear what Vashti did, what's to stop them from likewise refusing to comply with their own husbands? It's the power of an example. Other women might well see in Vashti an example and be inspired to do likewise. And so I wonder, what do we make of Vashti? Might we find inspiration in her refusal for whatever reasons and for whatever complex calculations she made? Her actions, I think, show how refusing to comply can disrupt systems of power, a point that extends well beyond gender. The work to bring a new world into being, as we'll sing in just a moment, remains. A new world where each gender, class, and race brings its rainbow colors to God's limitless embrace, as the song goes. A world where the word is one of welcome to the greatest and the least, calling those with power to service and all to share the feast, as our other hymn of response will put it. May we find strength and courage for the work ahead in Vashti's story. Amen.